And good evening, everybody, and welcome again to another edition of this call to the Bullpen. I'm your host, Steve Keene, and tonight my guest will be Doug Gladstone, the author of a book, A Bitter Cup of Coffee, How Major League Baseball and the Players Association Threw 874 Retirees a Curve. The book is published by Word Association Publishers at wordassociation.com. The book will cover 874 Major League Baseball players who played between the years of 1947 and 1979, who were not included in a 1980 decision by the Players Association of Major League Baseball to include players with 1 day of service in the big leagues to get medical benefits, and I believe it's 43 games to be covered under the pension program. Also joining Doug, myself, will be George Theodore, and that name, when you mention that name to Met fans, a big smile breaks out on their face. George only played 2 seasons with the Mets in 1973 and 74, but he was one of the most popular Met players of all time. And it's my pleasure to have George on the program today. We will talk later in the program. Big day today was Terry Collins. The new manager of the New York Mets was introduced at Citi Field, and he had some interesting things to say, and we'll have some comments on that in the second half of the show. And also we'll have to touch on the Derek Jeter situation here in New York, as Brian Cashman has kind of laid down the gauntlet by telling Jeter that he can go test the free agent waters if he likes and see if he can get a better deal than the 3 years, $45 million they've offered. That'll be very interesting to watch. I have both my guests are on, so we'll bring them on right now. Doug, how are you? This is Steve Keene, this call to the Bullpen. Thanks for coming on tonight.
Steve, thank you very much for having me and George on the program. I appreciate the opportunity to come on the show and talk about the book and talk about the issues that the book raises.
It's my pleasure. Let's bring George in. He's up here, too. George, good evening.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. I want to thank you for coming on the program tonight. I really appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome, and I hope you send us some sunshine. We're right in the middle of a terrible blizzard.
A blizzard?
Yeah.
Well, today in New York it was 64 degrees today, so
that's what we could use here.
Wow. Well, we want to get right to the book and to the subject of the book. And I have to say, Doug, when you sent me out the information on the email, to me this is one of the unkept secrets in all of sports. In the NFL, I know HBO's Real Sports did a whole expose on the NFL players, and with Mike Ditka leading the charge of trying to get benefits for the players of back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s who weren't covered under these new agreements. And we saw the plight of John Mackey, who has had some real difficult health problems, and Jim Otto, who used to play center for the Oakland Raiders. And I never knew that the same situation was in Major League Baseball. And, from reading everything that you sent me and checking things out, it's quite astonishing when you think about the Major League Baseball Players Association being as powerful as it is, allowing something like this to happen.
Steve, I couldn't agree with you more. Astonishing is one word to characterize it, an injustice, a travesty, an inequity. It's another word. Now, to be fair, I do need to put something out there. Legally, Major League Baseball doesn't have to do anything for the men impacted by this situation. And I do want to let you know that since the publication of my book earlier in April, 4 men have passed on. In fact, most recently, and George may want to touch upon this because a gentleman was a very close personal friend of his, a gentleman by the name of Jay Van Noy, who had a cup of coffee with the St. Louis Cardinals back in the 50s. He passed at the age of 82. He had just celebrated his 82nd birthday on November 4th, and 48 hours later, he died. There are technically 870 men who are now impacted by this situation. As I said, the league doesn't legally have to do anything for these men. The union does not have to strike or take any labor action on behalf of these men. But I think the point is that, these are the men, the George Theodores of the world, the Jimmy Qualls of the world, and I know, to any Mets fan, they're going to instantly recognize that name. The David Clydes of the world. These are the men who paved the path so that people like Jason Bay, could command his $64 million 4-year contract, or Matt Holliday could command his 7-year, $120 million contract, or A-Rod can, get $27.5 million a year. And I'm not begrudging these men anything. They're talented ball players. They deserve what they can get. And listen, let's call it what it is. The market is allowing them to command what some people would perceive are ridiculously obscene, ludicrous salaries. But have a little healthy respect for the men who came before you, who often went out on strike, who were locked out of spring training camps. Have a little healthy respect for some of these men. I know some of the guys I write about in the book, their first professional contract in the game was nothing more than $17,500 for a year. Some of these guys had plenty of jobs in the off season. Any Met fans going to remember, of course, the famous Richie Hebner. How many of us grew up, recalling that Richie Hebner was what? A grave digger during the off season. And of course, the gentleman who this, the Eddie Crane Pool Society is named after, sold life insurance during the off season. So, Michael Weiner, the executive director of the Players Union, has made comments for the record that he is committed to trying to help these men. I'm going to hold them to it, and hopefully in a not too distant future, men like George, and the 870 other odd ball players can be compensated for their credit and for their contributions to the national pastime.
Yeah. George, when you came up with the Mets in 1973, at that point it was a revolution in baseball, where the Players Association under Marvin Miller, and Marvin Miller was like the revolutionary, the guy leading the charge, where things were starting to change, going from the reserve clause to fighting for free agency, and building up this Players Association to one of the most powerful unions in the country. How did you feel when you found out about the 1980 decision and not grandfathering guys like you and players from 47 to 79? What did it make you think as a guy who was on the ground floor of this revolution to when the point you found out that you could not be included in this pension program and in these health benefits?
Well, I think myself and others like me, we didn't question it. You had to have 4 years in, and that was the accepted time period to qualify for the pension and the medical. And so it was Doug, the revolutionary, who has kind of brought into awareness that, baseball's had a long history of taking care of its players that have come before them. And that oftentimes when they've had their collective agreements, they will retroactive go back and include those that weren't included in the present case. So when 1980 did not do that, and Doug will talk about that, I didn't even think about it, to tell you the truth, until a few years ago when Doug contacted me. And, of course, he knows the history, and we didn't realize there was maybe a possible injustice going on. And so, anyway, that's kind of the history of it, and it's not like I resented it either, because I wasn't aware of anything different.
Well, Doug, when you found out about this through Jimmy Quarles.
That is correct.
And you were interviewing him for Baseball Digest, I believe it was.
Yeah, if I could, I had just come off doing a story for the Chicago Sun-Times. I was one of the last reporters to interview the late great comedic legend Larry Gelbart. That story was published last April, and my wife and I were just sitting around one day, and He said, well, okay, hotshot, what are you going to do for an encore? And I really didn't know. But I did know, of course, in the storied history of the New York Mets franchise, the date July 9th, 1969,